This morning's message is entitled, That's Not Fair. Now, I need a show of hands. Who in this room has never, ever said, that's not fair? Raise your hand. Oh, come on. I think most of us have. I think all of us have at some time. If we haven't said it, we've thought it. Something's not fair in life. Someone's not being fair to us. In fact, we talked about a man who interrupted Jesus' sermon or his message, his lesson last week, because his brother wasn't dividing the inheritance. That's not fair. Jesus, you tell him to divide the inheritance. And here we have a story in Matthew chapter 20 in verses 1 through 16 of the fairness of God. And some people would object and say, but you know, you're not dealing with people in a fair way. That's not fair. This is the 12th in our series on people, places, and things, parables that make a difference. Now, we've said this for 12 Sundays. A parable is a teaching that comes along, or a story that comes alongside a teaching to explain the teaching. And Jesus always taught with parables because he wanted people to understand the circumstances that are around what he's saying. And he brought them into their common, everyday, ordinary life. They seem antiquated and they seem to be foreign to us, and they are, simply because he was talking about things that occurred 2,000 years ago. If Jesus were here in the 21st century, he'd be talking about the St. Mary's River. He'd be talking about boats. He'd be talking about the UP. He'd be talking about Canada. He'd be bringing things home to us so that we can understand it from our perspective. And so here he is teaching about fairness. That's not fair is an exclamation I have heard or I have said quite often while growing up. My sister Paula and her husband Claire were here to visit for the weekend. In visiting with us, they came specifically because of the play, because of Camelot. This is the first time Kalita's ever been in community theater. And my brother-in-law said he came for one reason, drove all the way from central Illinois for one reason, and that was to see his brother-in-law, me, in tights. So he got an eyeful, I'm sure. But they were here, and they were here for our first service, and they left after first service this morning so they could start back home. Now, my sister, Paula, and I grew up in a family of 7. 5 kids, mom and dad. We had a small house, and we had a small car. And when you have 5 kids in a small house or in a small car, you start competing for space. Anyone ever been there? My sister was monkey in the middle. She had 2 brothers on one side and 2 brothers on the other, and she was the middle child. And so we found ourselves on this weekend, yesterday, squeezing into Kalita's VW convertible with the top down, 4 rather mature adults sitting in a tiny bug. And we drove to Point Iroquois. And then we went out to Wilcox's fish restaurant and had a really nice lunch. On our way back, we came all the way back straight, and rather than take Bakerside Road, we came all the way straight to Mackinac Trail on 6 Mile, and I turned left. And certainly you know that we have Amish in the community now. And there's a farm on the right-hand side that they're temporarily living in. And they were having a bake sale. Buggy out front, the Amish family standing there. And so we pulled in. And when we pulled in with the top down and we tried to peel out of the car, 2 Amish girls giggled. Well, we felt like we entertained them, so we went ahead and bought some of their product as well. But you know, that little car with its cramped conditions reminded my sister of what it was like growing up in a family of 5 kids in a small car. We had a Dodge Dart, a 2-door Dodge Dart. Oh my, yeah. And there were always 4 in the back seat and 3 in the front. Now, you know, you're invading space, you're invading territory, you know. He's touching me. No, he's not. You know, and so the fussing would start. Now, it didn't just continue only in situations like anytime we piled into that little Dodge Dart. For many years, I shared a bedroom with 3 brothers, 4 of us in one bedroom. And there were always bunk beds there, always bunk beds. Well, that car, though, reminded my sister of the air conditioning system we used to have. Top was down. Wind was in their hair. Really wasn't much in mine, but wind was in their hair. And my sister said, this really reminds me of the days when we were in the Dodge Dart and the windows were all down. And Kalita said, oh yeah, we had 460 air conditioning. 4 windows down at 60 miles an hour. And so we really had a good time visiting and chatting. But you know, the cramped conditions in that car and the memories of cramped condition in a house always brought up issues of fairness. In that Dodge Dart, we sat crammed side by side. In the house, we crammed into bedrooms. And there were times that we as kids felt like we had to fight for what we thought was fair and right. Now, after visiting the Mission Hill Overlook and then driving through the Mission Hill Cemetery yesterday, Paula asked Kalita and I if we've made any plans for the end of our lives. Because their children and our children are scattered in other states, the conversation needs to take place in both my sister's family and in mine. Well, believe it or not, the topic of the end of life brought back a childhood memory of fairness for me. Growing up, I said that we always shared a bedroom, and I cannot hardly remember when I didn't sleep in a bunk bed. Well, my older brother Steve and I shared the bunk bed. Whether we were in that room with 4 or whether we wound up in a room just the 2 of us, the bunk bed was there. And since Steve was the older one, he always got top bunk, and I didn't think that was fair. I thought, oh, one of these days, Steve, I'm going to get even with you. Back in 1990, unexpectedly, our older brother Steve died on his 38th birthday. 38 years old. My mom had some family plots in a cemetery close to where my grandmother lived and where my mom grew up. And so we dutifully buried my brother's casket in the first of those family plots. Some years later, our mother died. And when she died, she said she wanted to be cremated, but she wanted her urn to be buried back there in that cemetery at Mineral Ridge, Ohio, to be with the family. So we dutifully did that, and we brought the urn back. We had a memorial service at our small home church there in Ohio, and we went out to the cemetery, and we put her urn in the ground. We found out that cemetery allows urns to be placed above an existing casket, but we thought Mom just needed one space for herself, so her urn is buried there adjacent to our brother's. Well, it caused some conversation for Kalita and me on our way home from my mother's funeral service. And she said, what are you thinking about as far as where we will be interned or what's going to happen? And I said, you know, when I breathe my last, it really won't much matter to me what is done with my body. But if I am cremated, I want you to be sure to place my urn above my brother's. And then on that headstone, where there's a blank spot, and my name might be carved with the date of birth and the date of death, I want this sentence: I finally got the top bunk. I told her that some years ago. I'm telling you, and if it doesn't happen, you get all over her case, won't you? You see, people say that's not fair. It's not fair. Life is not fair. And words like that come as a result of feeling left out or feeling overlooked. The story Jesus tells here is a story of fairness. It's a story of earning what we deserve. It's really a parable that upsets the apple cart. People look at this story and they see a generous landowner that is going to reward his laborers at the end of the day but he doesn't reward them according to their work. And it seems unfair. It grates against any sentiment we might have of thinking that we should store for ourselves, we should have treasures, we should earn our keep. It grates against our notion of a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. Let's look at the story. Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. I'm going to read it in its entirety because it is a story, and we're going to let Jesus tell the story. Matthew chapter 20, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire men to work in his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard." And let me mention this, a denarius was a fair day's wage in Jesus' day. It was the amount of pay a person would earn in a day. About the third hour, he went out and he saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour and did the same thing. About the 11th hour of the day, he went out and found still others standing around in that courtyard. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they said. And he said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." And the workers who were hired at the 11th hour came, and each received a denarius. And when those who had hired first, they expected to receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These men who were hired last only worked an hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of work and the heat of the day." But he answered one of them, "Friend, I am not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the man who was hired last the same as I gave to you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" And so the last will be first, and the first will be last. Briefly, 4 things about this story. First of all, a landowner needed some workers. The guy was a farmer. He had crops, he had vineyards, he had grapes. They needed to be tended to, or he wouldn't have a harvest. And so he went to the local town and went to the town square where in the morning workers would assemble with the hopes of being hired out by someone that day for some work. And so this is what he did. And in this story, of course, God is the one who is the landowner, and we are the workers. We need to remember that we were chosen by God. We did not choose him. It's the landowner who goes out to those who are available and wanting to work, and he says, "I want you, and you, and you, and you, come with me." And he took them out for a full day's work. A full day's work, mind you, in Jesus' day was 12 hours. Please don't complain about 8. Because a full day's work was 12 hours, sunrise to sunset. And so in the very early morning, he chose some men, probably looking around and saying, "You know, you look strong, you look fast, you look like you really have some get up and go. You're the type of guys I need in my vineyard today. Come on, I'll give you a day's wage." "Oh, yes, sir." And so they went. And it was only fair. How many have ever been involved in any type of sandlot baseball or a playground game where you choose captains, and then the captains get to choose sides, and they pick the strongest, and they pick the fastest, and they pick the ones who know how to play the game, and then you wind up being there by yourself, and no one wants you? You ever been there? I have. It's just natural. I want the best I can get for my money. And so he chose these men. Then he went back to the courtyard. He went back to that gathering place. A few hours later, found others who still hadn't worked. He needed more in the field. He said, come on, I'll pay you what's fair. He did it again. The day was rapidly ending. I'll pay you what's fair. And then 1 hour before the day was over, the landowner went back to the courtyard, to the town square, and he saw a few men still standing there. Why aren't you working? No one picked us. And so he said, come on, I will call you to the field. I will pay you what you're worth. Now, with this, we need to see that God has agreed to pay us a wage for our work. What is the wage God's paying us? It's not for what we have done. It's because it's undeserved. He is paying us with heaven. Heaven. And there's not one single one of us in this room that can say we can earn that or that we deserve that. And He is giving us heaven. Listen to what Jesus said in John chapter 14. My Father's house has many rooms. If it weren't so, I would have told you. I am going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, so that you may be where I am. You know the way to the place I am going. Brothers and sisters, that's a wage that is more than fair. He wants to give us heaven if we follow Him. And so the landowner needs some workers, and he makes this agreement. Come to me, and I will give you rest. Come to me, I will give you what you do not deserve. Well, secondly, the workers did what they were hired to do. When the landowner returned to choose extra workers, he probably chose the ones that were still strapping and strong and just looked like they could really do a good job. And so he went on through the day until he came back to that public square one final time, 1 hour before sunset. Can you imagine who might be left by that time? The elderly, the infirmed, the inexperienced, someone with an injury or a disability that no one wanted to hire. These people probably could not have survived the day in the hot sun in that field. But they still had the same needs as the first ones that went out. They had families to feed. They had to provide for themselves. They had to have some sense of worth, some financial security. And still, they weren't hired. And so the owner told the foreman at the end of the day, after he brought in the worst of the bunch, the leftovers, he said, pay the ones who only worked 1 hour first. And they received, for 1 hour's work, a full day's wage. Well, God does that for us. He is one who is fair. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul said, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? He went on to say how important it is for us to understand that God rewards those who serve Him. He is not going to neglect us, just as God did not, as this owner did not neglect men who weren't well enough or strong enough to work a full day, but He gave them a full day's pay. You see, that's who God is. God is one who will honor those who are willing to do what He asks them to do. Well, of course, when payday came, when it came to the point of getting their money, there were complaints. There were complaints on payday. All the workers were hired for the same wage. All received the same amount of money, and you could hear the wail, "That's not fair." The landowner was gracious to the workers who were hired later. And you could hear the cry, "That's not fair." Now, it really might seem to be unfair to those who were chosen first because they had labored and toiled all day in the heat. They had been fighting insects all morning and all afternoon and into the hours of dusk. Why should they get paid the same as the guy who only worked 1 hour? That's not fair. But from the vineyard owner's perspective, from the man who was paying them all, He said the reality of life to these last ones hired has not been fair to them either. And I'm going to take care of them. I am going to take care of the ones who were chosen last. So what's this mean to us? What does it mean to us? Okay, we see the story, we understand the story. What's it mean to us in 2015 in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan? The good news that we proclaim is not just for the privileged few, but it's for all of us. And God wants it to be shared as many times as it will take for everyone to hear and receive the message, no matter if they come early in their lives or if they come just before they die. I told you a few weeks ago, actually it was in May on Mother's Day, that it had been 50 years since I stepped forward and made a decision for Christ. A 9-year-old boy walking up the aisle, giving his confession of his faith in Jesus Christ and being baptized. I've been at this for 50 years. But you know, one of the greatest joys I've had over the years is baptizing someone who is 80 or 90 years old and then preaching their funeral months later. Because God is fair. God is fair. And we need to understand that. We are all God's workers regardless of when we were selected. Our wages are not of this world, but God meets our needs. We do not have a position of authority just because we were hired sooner. I've been a Christian 50 years. That doesn't give me any rank over you who have only become Christians in the last year. We're all saved by the blood of Christ. We're all saved by the grace of Jesus. Jesus' question at the end of the story must hit home. He said, "Are you envious because God is so generous?" Let's not dare tell God that His rewards are not fair. Here is what the kingdom of heaven is like. God seeks us out. He all gives us the dignity of working, and we're all rewarded. We are rewarded with life and hope. We are rewarded with a future. We are rewarded no matter if we have served a lifetime or if we have only worked in the 11th hour. So why should we envy if someone else is blessed and seemingly we're not? Now, you know, when we pray the Lord's Prayer, we repeat the words, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Don't we? We always say it in the King James Version, always repeat those words in that fashion. Heaven is the ultimate generosity of God. It's the reward. But what did Jesus say? Yes, the kingdom is coming, but we've got to do your will here and now. It's got to be heaven on earth. We've got to start living like we are residents of heaven. I have a rolling screensaver on my computer. It's on my office. If you've ever been in there and we've chatted, you probably have seen the computer go to its screensaver mode. And there's 4 words that bounce around my screen as a screensaver. Those 4 words are "so what," "now what." I've used that screensaver for over a dozen years on different computers in different offices. So what? Now what? It serves as a constant reminder that what I do in preaching, what I do in sharing Jesus, what I do in any Sunday school class or any midweek study or any counseling has to answer those 2 questions. So what? Now what? And if the screensaver would have accepted one more word, I would have had another word, another question. How? Okay, we have the message of Jesus. So what? What do we do with it? How do we convey it? How do we share it? It's not enough to know what Jesus said. We need to know, we need to do what He says. Not just to know it, but to do it, and we need to do it here, we need to do it now, we need to do it today. Now please, please do not misunderstand what I've been saying or what Jesus taught in Matthew 20. Some people may take this story and say, you know what that means? I can live like the devil all my life, and I just have to come to Jesus at the end of my life, and I'm fine. I'm okay. I've got plenty of time. I can do that. No, you don't. No, you don't. And neither do I. My brother died on his 38th birthday. Completely unexpected death. My brother liked to write. And he used to write and try to submit articles for publication. And he had a few things published, but he continued to write over the years. After my brother's death, after his funeral, when we had to go through his possessions, we found some notebooks. And we found out that he was still keeping a little bit of a journal, not writing all the time, but writing down his thoughts. And months before my brother died, he was saying, I still don't know what I want to do with my life. Basically, he was saying, I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. He wrote that when he was 37. He was dead when he was 38. It was the 11th hour, and he didn't know it. Now, my brother, thankfully, was a Christian. He had accepted Christ. He was trying to follow Christ. He had his mistakes. He had his bumps and his ups and downs. And as far as his life and a career and all those things that we think are so important, he was stumbling through that, but he had a faith that was holding him steady with God. Still. 37 years old, I don't know what I want to be. 38, he was in the grave. This may be our 11th hour. This may be the last Sunday you will ever hear the gospel. Don't think that you've got time. God knows when the time ends. He knows when it's our 11th hour. And we cannot excuse ourselves and say, I don't have to follow the teachings of Jesus yet. I can get away with stuff. Buddy. Because the time comes when there's no more opportunity for decisions. You see, Jesus calls us to Him in the first hour of the day, in the third hour of the day, in the 9th hour of the day, and even in that 11th hour, He is still extending His invitation. Is God fair? Well, absolutely not. He's not fair. Because if God were truly fair, none of us would go to heaven, right? If God were fair, none of us would go to heaven. We'd all pay for our sins. But God's not fair. God's grace, God's mercy, God's love. And He extends that to us over and over and over again. Those who are first will be last. And those who are last will be first. That affirmation talks about equality. God says we're all on the same plane. All of us. We're all on the same field. God has given us grace, and not only is that grace fair, it is abundant, and it's more than we ever need, and it's something we have to share. God does not give us what is fair. He offers us what is undeserved. He offers us His love, and He offers us His grace. And this may be your 11th hour. You don't know. But maybe the Spirit of God is working on your heart right now because God knows. And maybe today's the day you need to say, I will accept your offer of grace. I will make this the day of my salvation.